Okay, well, some of the things that you noticed in the video about Copan was, one, they found burials where not only were a small number of people buried with all these wealth items like jade and fine pottery, but the pottery also had symbols on them that were sort of, again, showing the ideology, symbols of power, symbols that showed that those special people had knowledge, esoteric knowledge, as they said. The other important thing you saw was that stone sculpture that recorded that the founder of the dynasty passed down his rulership to his son, right? And so that shows that status and power were inherited, and those are key markers of a complex society. So that was most likely a chiefdom at that time in that Maya site of Copan. So in complex societies, chiefdoms and states are both complex. Bands and tribes are not. In complex societies, status, wealth is inherited, right? Passed down from the parents to the children. In bands and tribes, it is not. So how do you identify these? Well, if you found a society where all the villages were basically the same size, there weren't a lot of differences between people in terms of wealth and the burials, it might be a band or a tribe, right? If there were some differences in wealth, maybe it was a higher level tribe. If you saw large villages and smaller villages, and in the large village there were monuments and large houses and burials that had lots of wealth and things like prestige goods, then it would most likely be a chiefdom, right? Okay, so this then leads to the next level, what we typically call states. Archaeologists tend to use the term state rather than civilization because civilization kind of has the connotation of everything else is not civilized. And we know as anthropologists that all societies, bands, tribes, chiefdoms are organized. They have norms and complex belief systems, and so it would be kind of a mistake to say that they're not a civilization. So instead we'll call them states. So state societies are like ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, the Aztec, the Maya, that we're going to talk about. And we're going to look at how did bands become tribes, how did tribes become chiefdoms, how did chiefdoms become states. All right, so this is a important city in Mesopotamia. One of the key differences between a state and a chiefdom is, one, states are larger. Instead of having large villages, in states you have cities. Cities like Babylon, cities like Thebes in Egypt, right? We're going to look at some of these famous cities. So states tend to have larger populations, but also large cities. But that's not the only difference. It's not just size, because states are also more diverse, right? So there's greater diversity within the society. You don't just have nobles, craftspeople, and farmers. You have lots of different kinds of people in the middle. And you also have complex, usually in many cities, marketplaces where people from different territories could trade with each other. Lots of craft specialization going on, and we're going to see that in many different cultures. But you would not just have nobles, but you would have people in the middle, like I said before, merchants. You would also have scribes, right? This is an Egyptian scribe. You would have bureaucrats. If you were living in ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, like you see here, and you broke the law, you would be arrested, and then you would have to go to court, and there would be a trial, and someone would record the verdict. Right? And they would refer to the laws that were written down as to what the punishment should be. These societies, these state societies, were very complex within the society, right? There are lots of different people involved in running the society: bureaucrats, administrators, scribes, viziers. Within the military, you wouldn't just have warriors, but you would have generals, officers, infantry people, right? So it wasn't just bigger. A state is not just a large chiefdom. A state works differently. A king is much more powerful than a chief. Why? Well, a king will have more wealth because it's a larger society. There's more surplus to draw from. The king will have a larger labor force. So what the king is able to do with, let's say, 1 million people, or at least 500,000 people, compared to a chief with, and I didn't say the size of a chiefdom, but the size of a chiefdom is about 5,000 to maybe 50,000. A state is 100,000 to 200,000, and sometimes you get states in as large as 1 million. So with that kind of large labor force, you can do so much in terms of building monuments and other things. Plus, you're generating huge surpluses, and your craft specialization is probably advanced beyond the point of a chiefdom level society at that stage as well. So there's much greater, what can you say it with me? Just kidding. Social stratification and much greater political centralization. The difference between the top and the bottom in Egypt is much greater than the top and the bottom in Hawaii, right? And so here you can see in kind of the social pyramid, you would have, this is very simple, you would have a lot more diversity here. Okay, so what would be the evidence for states? Well, cities, obviously, evidence of kings, right? It would have to be probably a certain size, a diversity within the state, administration, things like that. So how did complex societies originate in the first place? What led to the state? Can we talk about the way we talked about agriculture, come up with a theory to test? Remember we talked about the oasis theory and the natural habitat theory to explain agriculture. Can we do the same thing with states? And really it should say not complex societies, but states. Can we look at states and try and come up with a reason why they emerged? Well, a number of people have tried. Let's look at some of the things that they said. So one of the earliest theories proposed was what's called the hydraulic theory. Now, based on the name, you know that it has to do with water. Karl Wittfogel came up with this idea, said, Egypt, ancient Egyptian civilization, grew up along the banks of the Nile. Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates. China, the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. The ancient civilizations of India on the Indus River. So all these civilizations grew up on rivers. Now you could see here in Egypt, there's only so far you could expand. This area is good for agriculture, but what if you want to expand further? What would you have to do in order to grow crops in certain areas? Well, according to Wittfogel, as these societies got bigger, they would need to bring the water to the fields. And they would have to do this with irrigation. So they'd have to build canals to bring water to the fields. According to Wittfogel, irrigation is pretty complex, right? It's sort of like plumbing and infrastructure and streets. You don't just build it and that's it. It has to be maintained or it won't work anymore. Plus, it's, according to Wittfogel, kind of complex to build. So you would need, what do you think you would need in order for something like that to be built? You would need a labor force. You would need a certain number of people. But according to Wittfogel, you would also need some sort of organization or leadership, right? People to organize the workforce, people to pay the workforce, people to figure out who's showing up and who isn't. This is bureaucracy. And bureaucracy and complex bureaucracy is essentially the state. So according to Wittfogel, the need for irrigation led to the emergence of the state. Right? Irrigation required management, coordination. That's essentially a state kind of organization. The state emerges as a result. Right? Now, could you test this archaeologically? You could, and people have. And what you would do is you would dig at a site and you would try to see, is there evidence of irrigation, and around the same time, evidence that the state is emerging. And they've done this in several areas of the world. And what they found, as we'll see in places like Mesopotamia, is that this theory does not explain the rise of the state in many areas of the world. In Mesopotamia, you have irrigation early on, but the kind of irrigation you have in Mesopotamia doesn't require organization at a large scale. Only after the state is formed do you get large-scale irrigation in Mesopotamia. So it was a good attempt. Wittfogel came up with an idea and people tested it. So other people came up with other ideas. Carneiro looked at places like in South America and called his theory, and it's very, very cumbersome name, population growth in a circumscribed environment. There's a very much easier way to describe it. But he said, imagine you have these different villages in certain areas and they're circumscribed, which means they can't expand past a certain area. You can see there's desert around here. So they could grow big to a certain size, but they can't grow any bigger than that because there's no field and beyond this point, and there won't be enough food for people, and there'll be a crisis. And over, let's say, the next sand dune or a few sand dunes down there, you have another village just like this, and there's another village over there that's just like it as well. Now, as they settle down, the population increases, they might get to a point where the population is bigger than their food supply. So what do? Well, according to Carneiro, what he thought would happen was conflict. Right? So there'd be war between these villages. Now, some people say, and this sounds very counterintuitive, but they say warfare is one of the most cooperative things people can do. And that doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it first, because these people are not cooperating at all. But within the group, warfare is very cooperative, right? That is, if you cooperate within the group, within the army, you have organization, you will succeed in battle better than an enemy that is less organized, less, let's say, hierarchical, less coordinated, and you will win and you will conquer that enemy. So in that way, warfare is cooperative. And again, when we were talking about social stratification, political centralization, we're really talking about hierarchy there, right? Differences between people. So according to Carneiro, population growth leads to problems with the food supply in these circumscribed areas. That leads to the need for war. War requires organization. The more organized you are, the more successful you'll be. You conquer another society. Now those leaders are rewarded with wealth. They become even more powerful, and they also have people that they conquered. This essentially leads to the state. So Carneiro's theory could be called the warfare hypothesis. He makes many assumptions. One is that population just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there are no checks on it. And we know that's not true. People do prevent their population from getting too big in many societies. His other assumption is that warfare is the inevitable result of this kind of crisis, and that's not true either. So again, in areas of the world where this has been tested, what we see in many areas of the world, that you don't have lots of warfare until after the state. So in many civilizations, war doesn't make the state. State makes war later, after it forms. Okay, so that doesn't explain civilization everywhere in the world. Irrigation doesn't explain the rise of the state everywhere in the world. Other ideas. Well, some people propose long-distance trade. If you're a society that needs something from another area and you have to trade for it, that requires organization, because you need to produce something to trade for what you want. You need to organize merchants to go over long distances and trade with those people. And so some people think the need for long-distance trade required people to be more organized, and that led to the state. Okay, let's look at two other ideas. Another idea that archaeologists sometimes use is related to the ideas of Marx, Karl Marx, Marxist perspectives. Where if you're a Marxist, what that means is, not necessarily that you're a communist, but if you're a Marxist theorist, it means that the economy structures everything else. If you understand the economy, then you can understand everything, and obviously that is not entirely true. But according to Marx, there are people who have, and there are people who have more. It's maybe not quite haves and have-nots yet, but the have-mores, let's call them, want to keep their wealth permanent. So what do they do to keep their wealth permanent? Well, in this class conflict, what the have-mores do is to create a belief system and invent the state to make sure that their status is fixed and permanent, and it's a rigid class system. Right? So you could take the ideology of Egypt and the ancient pharaohs as an example. According to ancient Egypt ideology, the pharaoh was considered, the king of ancient Egypt was considered to be a god. Right? Not a representation of a god, the god Horus, as we're going to see. Now, if you are Marxists, you would say, well, that's not a coincidence. I mean, it's a lucky accident that the belief system happens to support the people in charge. They would say that's not a coincidence. The people in charge invented that idea to support themselves and to make sure that people would follow along. It's very hard to prove this kind of idea. It's hard to get inside the heads of these ancient people. So it's hard to find evidence to really back this up, right? But according to this kind of Marxist idea, there's class conflict. There's a struggle between the have and the have-mores. And this class conflict eventually leads to the people on top inventing the state. So it's oversimplified, and it doesn't work in many areas, and it's also hard to find evidence to even test it. Okay, well, as you've probably seen, when you start to come up with a single theory that's going to explain the state everywhere in the world through time, you're probably going to fail, because in different places, states arose for different reasons. And that's where this systems theory idea comes into play. It was developed by two professors at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and they basically said, a society is like a system. There are inputs and outputs, and there are multiple causes, right? So their idea is basically, it's a little bit like here. You have many things going on: population, warfare, irrigation, trade. All of these different things influence each other. There's kind of feedbacks. Because it could be multiple things, it could be one thing that's more important in one civilization and another factor that's more important in another civilization. So each case is different, and you have to look at each case separately. Right? Okay. So overall, the theories we looked at were irrigation with Wittfogel, the hydraulic theory; warfare with Carneiro; long-distance trade, Marxist ideas, and then also this systems approach that explores multiple reasons. Okay, so we're going to look, when we look at these civilizations, we're going to try to see if archaeologists have figured out why these states emerged at certain times. Right? Okay, with states also comes kind of a different understanding of leaders and the people that form the majority of the civilization. Many people think that there's kind of an obligation of leaders to the people they rule, right? That is, they have to provide them with certain things. And as you're going to see when we start to look at collapse of societies, there are basic needs of a society. And if those needs are not met, that society might erode, and it may even collapse. And some of these needs are very, very basic. Food, shelter, water, right? Those are basic needs. In our society, we would probably say the internet is a basic need, especially now, right? With quarantining, if someone did not have the internet, how could they, it's just going to be much more difficult for them. So I would say the internet is a basic need for people. People need it to function well in the society. What else do people need for society to work well? Well, they need order. You can't have chaos. If there's chaos, you can't have a functioning society. Right? What else do they need? Well, they need something to hold them together, some sort of identity, like we are all Egyptians, or we are all Americans, or we are all French, or whatnot. That kind of binds people together, and it makes them invested in the system as a whole. And when you don't have something like that, you have societies that kind of break down a little bit or are not held together very strongly. I would say Afghanistan's a good example of this, because you have so many different ethnic groups that have struggled against each other for a very long time, living in an arbitrary bounded country. The boundaries were created by the British, and in many respects, people's loyalty is to their region and ethnic group more so than to Afghanistan in general. And so you kind of have to have some sort of identity that holds people together. But if you do, you could have a very powerful state, right? And every state needs bureaucracy. We tend to say, "Oh, I hate bureaucracy," right? I hate the IRS. Well, we may not like paying taxes, but what if there was no IRS? Could the government function without keeping track of the money coming in, the money going out? Of course not. Could the university function without the registrar's office? Of course not. When we say we hate bureaucracy, what we really mean is we hate inefficient bureaucracy that doesn't work. When bureaucracy works and the government is organized, you can do so many incredible things. This is a picture of the 1950s of the interstate that was built after World War II, right? So that was a government project that had to be built on a grand scale. When we look at different societies, we're also going to see things like displays of power. Sometimes leaders will try to increase their power, maintain their power through monuments, as we talked about, through ideology or belief system, right? So things like statues of a leader might help create that idea, or political propaganda, right? So this is a poster showing Joseph Stalin with a ghostly version of Lenin over his shoulder. And what's trying to be communicated here is that Lenin is, looking favorably down on the rulership of Stalin. And the reality of the history is that Lenin actually hated Stalin and warned people of Stalin. So this is not historically accurate, but it's propaganda to try and influence people. Right? So in all of this, you have ideology. Again, ideology is a belief system. So if you were trying to convince someone of something, you would try to use ideology. Leaders try to do this as well. So, think of an example today. If, let's say, you were making a speech or you were talking to people, and these people were, let's say, politically conservative, and you're trying to convince them to do something, right? How would you phrase it? What would you appeal to? Well, you would probably appeal to a sense of independence, freedom, individual rights, sort of maybe anti-government sentiments, right? You'd say, you should do this so you could, because it's your right as an individual to do so, or something like that. Whereas if you were talking to a more, let's say, politically left group of people, you might say, "Oh, you need to do this because, it will help the environment, or it will help create a more just society," or something like that. You appeal to the belief system of the people, and so there's many forms of ideologies today. Communism, fascism, right? What we find more in our society is conservatism, neoconservatism, liberalism, libertarianism, right? So Justin Amash is an example of libertarian, where he's our local congressperson, where less government influence control is better. Someone who is more like a New Deal FDR type Democrat would say government programs are good, we need more of them, right? So this is part of a belief system. So leaders then just kind of tap into the belief system to influence people. And we're going to see some examples of that. Okay, in the next video, we're going to look at ancient writing systems. And we're going to see how writing developed in different areas for different reasons. And you guys are going to watch a video on the ancient Maya writing system. I'll also show you a little bit of how you can actually do some cuneiform. I will see you in the next video.